A billionaire walked into a flower shop to pick out wedding arrangements with his fiancée, and the moment he stepped through the door, his entire life split in two. Welcome to Mr.HarrisonStories. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. When the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10 and share what you felt along the way. And if you enjoy emotional stories filled with twists and hidden truths, make sure to follow Mr.HarrisonStories so you don't miss the next one. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy every detail. The Saturday morning light hit the Philadelphia skyline in that golden way that made everything look like a movie set. Malcolm Crane adjusted his cufflinks in the back of his black Escalade. Barely listening to his fiancée, Audrey Lancaster, rehearse the florist appointment like it was a board presentation. I'm thinking white peonies for the ceremony, but the reception should have something bolder. Maybe ranunculus with eucalyptus accents. What do you think? Malcolm didn't think anything about ranunculus. He wasn't even sure what ranunculus looked like. At 42, he'd built Crane Biomedical into one of the largest pharmaceutical research companies on the East Coast. He could read a clinical trial report in 6 minutes and spot the flaw that a team of scientists missed. But flowers were not his area. Whatever you like, he said, the same answer he gave to most of Audrey's wedding questions. Audrey sighed with the particular patience of a woman who'd learned to accept that her fiancé's emotional range operated between focused on work and slightly less focused on work. She was beautiful in the way magazines loved, tall, blonde. Her bone structure practically engineered for charity galas. Their engagement had been featured in Philadelphia magazine under the headline, Power Couple of the Year, and Audrey had framed the article. "You could at least pretend to care," she said, though there was no real heat behind it. "Your mother specifically asked us to choose the flowers together. She says it shows unity." His mother, Constance Crane, who had opinions about everything from table linens to what kind of woman was appropriate for the Crane family name. Constance had hand-picked Audrey the way she hand-picked everything in Malcolm's life, with strategic precision and zero sentimentality. The Escalade pulled up to a narrow storefront on a tree-lined street in Chestnut Hill. The sign above the door read, Bloomfield in hand-painted sage green letters. Wisteria climbed the brick facade, and through the front window Malcolm could see buckets of wildflowers, wooden shelves stacked with ceramic vases, and warm light that looked nothing like the fluorescent sterility of his corner office. "This is the place?" Malcolm asked. It looked small, handmade, the kind of shop that smelled like someone's grandmother's garden. "Elise Harmon recommended it," Audrey said, checking her lipstick in a compact mirror. "Apparently the owner is some kind of local genius with arrangements. Very authentic, very artisanal. That's the aesthetic we want." They stepped inside, and a bell chimed softly above the door. The shop smelled like lavender and wet earth, and something sweeter underneath, like honey warming in the sun. Malcolm felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. And then he saw her. She was standing behind the counter with her back to the door, reaching up to adjust a hanging fern. Her dark hair was twisted into a loose knot at the base of her neck, and she wore a denim apron over a simple white t-shirt. Her hands were stained with pollen, her fingernails edged with soil, and when she turned around, Malcolm Crane forgot how to breathe. Isla. 5 years collapsed into nothing. 5 years of boardrooms, investor calls, strategic partnerships, and carefully constructed denial. All of it evaporated the moment Isla Prescott's brown eyes met his across a counter full of sunflowers. She froze, the watering can in her hand tilted, and water spilled across the counter in a slow stream that neither of them moved to stop. "Welcome to Bloomfield," she said, and her voice was the same, warm and slightly husky and carrying that particular steadiness that had always made Malcolm feel like the ground beneath him was solid. "How can I help you?" She was looking at him like a stranger. Deliberately, carefully, like she'd practiced this exact moment in her mind and decided that the safest response was no recognition at all. "We're here for wedding flowers," Audrey said, stepping forward with her phone already open to a Pinterest board. "I called last week." "The Lancaster Crane wedding? June 14th? Something shifted behind Isla's eyes at the word wedding, but her expression stayed professional. Of course. I have your file right here. Let me pull up some options. Malcolm couldn't move. He was staring at the shop like a man who'd stumbled into a dream he'd been having for years. The walls were covered with framed botanical illustrations, some clearly drawn by a child's hand, bright crayon flowers with crooked stems with too many rays. A small corner near the back had a child-sized table with coloring books and a jar of crayons. 2 tiny rain boots sat by the back door, one yellow and one red, different sizes, too. His heart began to hammer. Malcolm? Audrey touched his arm. Are you listening? She asked if you prefer a more structured arrangement or something organic. Organic, he said without thinking, his eyes still locked on those rain boots. Isla led them through the shop, showing samples and to discussing seasonal availability, all while maintaining a distance from Malcolm that felt deliberate, like she'd drawn an invisible line between them and was daring him to cross it. Her hands moved through flowers with a grace that reminded him of the way she used to trace the blueprints of the community clinic she'd dreamed of opening someday. That was before the night his mother ruined everything. These would be lovely for the ceremony, Isla said, holding up a cluster of white garden roses. But her fingers trembled, just slightly, and Malcolm saw it because he'd spent 2 years of his life memorizing the language of her hands. The back door of the shop swung open, and Malcolm's world tilted off its axis entirely. A little girl, maybe 4 years old, burst through the door with the chaotic energy of someone who'd just discovered something extraordinary. Her dark, curly hair bounced wildly around her face, and she was holding a jar with something alive in it. Mama, look, a caterpillar. It's green, and it has tiny feet, and I counted them, and there's like 1,000,000. Behind her, moving more slowly, came a boy about the same age. He had Isla's brown eyes but darker skin, and his expression was serious and watchful in a way that made Malcolm's stomach drop. The boy was carrying a notebook, and he looked up at Malcolm with a quiet intensity that felt uncomfortably familiar. Because Malcolm recognized that look, he saw it every morning in his own mirror. Cora, honey, we have customers, Isla said quickly, her voice carrying a note that made both children look at her more carefully. The girl, Cora, glanced at Malcolm and Audrey with bright, curious eyes, then held up her jar. Do you want to see my caterpillar? His name is Professor Buttons. What a wonderful name, Audrey said with the polite smile she reserved for other people's children. But Malcolm wasn't looking at the caterpillar. He was looking at the boy, who was still watching him with those quiet, measuring eyes that were gray-green, unusual, striking. Malcolm's eyes. And who's this? Malcolm heard himself ask, his voice coming from somewhere far away. That's my brother, Cora announced. His name is Jonah. He doesn't talk much to strangers, but he's actually really smart. He knows every planet in the solar system and also some moons. Jonah said nothing. He just held his notebook against his chest and studied Malcolm the way a scientist might study an unknown specimen. The math began running in Malcolm's head, the same way it ran through financial models and clinical data. 5 years since they'd been together. These children were about 4 years and some months. The timeline aligned with terrifying precision. Cora, Jonah, go finish your lunch in the back, please, Isla said. And there was an urgency in her voice that Malcolm recognized as fear. Cora pouted. But Professor Buttons wants to meet the tall man. Now, please. Something in Isla's tone made both children move immediately. Cora grabbed Jonah's hand and pulled him toward the back room. But Jonah looked over his shoulder one last time at Malcolm, and in that brief glance was a question the boy probably couldn't even articulate yet. Adorable kids, Audrey said. Already back to scrolling her Pinterest board. Are they yours? Yes, Isla said. The single word was a wall. Malcolm felt like the floor was dissolving beneath him. His mind raced through calculations that had nothing to do with pharmaceutical patents. Isla had been pregnant when she left. She must have been. She'd walked away from him 5 years ago carrying his children, and she'd never said a word. Why? But he already knew why. The answer was branded into his memory like a scar. I think we've seen enough for today, Malcolm said abruptly. Audrey looked up from her phone. But we haven't even discussed the centerpiece options. I have a conference call. We'll come back. Malcolm, the wedding is in 3 months. We can't just. We'll come back, Audrey. Something in his voice, some fracture in the careful control he maintained like armor, made Audrey stop arguing. She gathered her things with the efficient displeasure of someone used to being second to his schedule. As they left the shop, Malcolm glanced back through the window. Isla stood behind the counter, both hands pressed flat against the surface, her head bowed, and in the back room, through a half-open door, he could see Cora showing her caterpillar jar to Jonah, who was sketching something in his notebook with the focused concentration of a child who'd learned to find safety in quiet observation. His children who didn't know his name. That night, Malcolm sat alone in his study with 2 fingers of bourbon and the weight of 5 years pressing down on his chest. His penthouse overlooked the Schuylkill River, all glass and polished concrete, and the kind of minimalist furniture that cost a fortune to look like nothing. It had been featured in Architectural Digest. It felt like living inside a museum. He'd dismissed Audrey with an excuse about the Singapore trial data. She'd been annoyed but unsuspicious. Work always came first with Malcolm, and she'd long ago exited that as the price of admission. His fingers hovered over the search bar on his laptop. Then he typed her name. The results made his chest tight. Local florist, Isla Prescott, builds blooming business as single mother of twins. From heartbreak to hydrangeas, how one woman turned loss into a thriving flower shop. He clicked through articles and photos. Isla at a farmer's market, laughing with customers. Isla at a neighborhood block party, Cora on her hip and Jonah holding her hand. A profile in Philadelphia Weekly that described her as the kind of small business owner who remembers every customer's name and what flowers they bought for their mother's birthday. She'd built a life. A beautiful, meaningful life that had nothing to do with him. The article mentioned the twins by name. Cora Joy Prescott and Jonah Malcolm Prescott. Malcolm. She'd given the boy his name. He set down the bourbon because his hands were shaking too badly to hold the glass. Malcolm. She'd carried his children alone, birthed them alone, raised them alone, and she'd still given their son his name. Not as an invitation, maybe, but as an acknowledgement. A thread connecting these children to a father they'd never met. His phone buzzed. Audrey. Don't forget brunch with your mother tomorrow. She wants to finalize the guest list. Wear the charcoal Tom Ford. Malcolm stared at the message, then at the photo of Isla laughing at the farmer's market, then at the ceiling of his expensive, empty apartment. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning at 7, Malcolm stood across the street from Bloomfield, wearing jeans for the first time in months. The shop wasn't open yet, but through the window he could see lights on in the back. A small figure moved past the glass. Cora, already awake, carrying what appeared to be a watering can nearly as big as she was. He waited until Ella came to unlock the front door, her keys jangling in the early quiet. She saw him immediately. Her whole body went still, the way a deer freezes when it senses a predator, and Malcolm hated himself for being the thing she was afraid of. We're not open yet, she said. I know. I'm not here for flowers. Isla glanced back into the shop where the children were, then stepped outside, pulling the door nearly closed behind her, protecting them. Even now. What do you want, Malcolm? Jonah Malcolm Prescott, he said quietly. You gave him my name. The color drained from her face, then rushed back in a wave of defiance. I gave him a name. It doesn't belong to you. Isla, they're mine, aren't they? She was quiet for a long time. The street was still waking up around them. A bakery 2 doors down, sending the smell of fresh bread into the morning air. A woman walking her dog on the opposite sidewalk. Do you remember the Crane Foundation gala? Isla asked instead of answering. The night your mother's friends decided to teach me my place? The memory hit him like a fist. Isla in the green dress she'd saved for 3 months to buy. His promise to stay beside her. The way he'd gotten pulled into a conversation with Dr. Feldstein about the clinical trials, and then Audrey's father had cornered him about the hospital board seat. And suddenly 2 hours had vanished. He'd found her afterward in the coat check room, shaking, her dress soaked with champagne that someone had poured down the front of it. Not accidentally, deliberately, publicly, while a circle of his mother's friends watched and laughed. She'd tried to tell him what happened, and he'd been stressed, distracted, still calculating the political implications of the board seat. His mother had called before Isla could finish, her voice cold and clipped, telling him that his little project had embarrassed the family by making a scene at the gala. He'd believed his mother. He'd looked at Isla's tear-streaked face and asked her why she couldn't just try harder to fit in. She'd left that night with a look that should have shattered him if he'd been paying attention. The look of someone who finally understood that love without protection was just a prettier word for loneliness. "I remember," Malcolm said, and the words tasted like ash. "Then you know why I didn't tell you. I was wrong. I was so wrong, Isla." "You weren't wrong, you were honest." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright, with tears she refused to let fall. "You showed me exactly where I stood in your life. Behind your mother, behind your company, behind every person in that room who mattered more than me. That's not. I found out I was pregnant 6 weeks after I left. Twins." She laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that held no joy. "I was 27, alone, broke, pregnant with twins by a man who couldn't even defend me against a glass of champagne. So I made a choice. I chose them." Every word was a blade, and Malcolm stood there and took each one because he deserved every cut. "I want to know them," he said. "I want to be their father." "You want to be their father." Ela repeated it flatly. "You're engaged, Malcolm. You're marrying the daughter of the man who sits on your board. You live in a world where people like me get champagne poured on them for the crime of existing, and you want to be their father?" "Yes, Mama?" Cora's face appeared in the doorway, her curls wild from sleep. "Are you talking to the tall man from yesterday?" Isla wiped her eyes quickly. "Go back inside, baby." But Cora had already spotted Malcolm, and she had the kind of fearless curiosity that no amount of parental warning could contain. She pushed the door open wider, revealing Jonah standing just behind her, his notebook clutched to his chest, watching. "Hi," Cora said to Malcolm. "Did you come back to see Professor Buttons? He made a cocoon last night. Mama says he's going to be a butterfly, but I think he might be a moth, and that's okay too because moths are just nighttime butterflies." Malcolm knelt down and the movement felt like the most natural thing he'd ever done. "I'd love to see Professor Buttons." Jonah stepped forward, just slightly. "Are you the man from the picture?" he asked quietly. The question made both adults freeze. "What picture?" Isla asked carefully. Jonah opened his notebook and showed them a drawing. 2 stick figures, a tall one and a small one, standing under a tree. The tall figure had gray-green scribbled eyes. "I drew him," Jonah said simply. "I didn't know who he was, but I wanted him to be real." Malcolm felt something break open inside his chest that he didn't know how to fix. "Can he stay for breakfast?" Cora asked. "I'm making toast." "Well, Mama makes the toast, but I put the jelly on and I'm really good at it." Isla looked at Malcolm, and he could see the war behind her eyes. Every protective instinct built over 5 years of single motherhood fighting against something older. Something she'd buried so deep she'd almost forgotten it was there. "Please," Malcolm said. Not demanding, not negotiating. Just asking, the way he should have asked 5 years ago. "Please let me stay." Isla studied his face for a long moment. Then she stepped aside and let him through the door. Breakfast was chaos in the most beautiful way imaginable. Cora narrated every step of the jelly application process, with the intensity of a cooking show host, while Jonah quietly arranged his toast into geometric patterns and occasionally shared a fact about metamorphosis that was startlingly accurate for a 4-year-old. "Did you know?" Jonah said, carefully cutting his toast into triangles. "That when a caterpillar is inside the cocoon, it completely dissolves? Like it turns into soup, and then the soup becomes a butterfly." "I didn't know that," Malcolm said. "That's incredible." "It's kind of scary," Cora added, jelly on her chin. "Imagine being soup." "But the butterfly doesn't remember being scared," Jonah said thoughtfully. "It just flies." Malcolm looked at Isla across the small kitchen table. She was watching their children with an expression of fierce, exhausted love. She'd been the caterpillar and the cocoon and the butterfly all at once, dissolving and rebuilding and somehow learning to fly while carrying 2 small humans on her wings. His phone buzzed. Audrey, then his mother, then his assistant, the outside world demanding his attention, his compliance, his performance. He turned the phone off. 3 days later, Malcolm walked into his mother's living room and told Constance Crane the truth. Constance sat in her wingback chair like a queen on a throne. At 68, She still carried herself with the rigid posture of a woman who believed that discipline was the highest virtue and sentiment was a weakness to be managed. "You have grandchildren," Malcolm said. "Twins. A boy and a girl. They're 4 years old, and they're extraordinary." Constance's face went through several calculations before settling on controlled displeasure. "The florist's children, my children. Malcolm, darling, be reasonable. A paternity claim from someone in her position is hardly." She never made a claim. She never asked me for anything. She raised them alone because I failed her so completely that she didn't trust me to be part of their lives. He paused. And she was right not to. Constance set down her teacup with the careful precision of someone maintaining composure by force of will. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm not proposing anything. I'm telling you. I'm going to be their father. I'm ending things with Audrey, and I'm going to spend however long it takes earning back the trust of a woman whose only crime was loving me while not being rich enough for your approval. You're throwing away everything we've built." "No, Mother. I'm finally building something that matters." Constance stood, and for a moment, Malcolm saw something flicker across her face that might have been genuine emotion. "That woman is not suitable. That woman built a business from nothing while raising my children alone. She teaches them about butterflies and kindness and how to be brave. She's more than suitable. She's remarkable. And the only unsuitable person in this story is me for taking 5 years to realize it." He left before his mother could respond. Telling Audrey was harder than he expected. Not because he loved her, but because she didn't deserve to be collateral damage in his awakening. She took the ring off without tears, which told him everything about what their relationship had actually been. "I knew something was wrong when you said organic at the flower shop," she said with a small wry smile. "You've never had an opinion about aesthetics in your life." "I'm sorry, Audrey." "Don't be sorry. Be a good father." She picked up her purse and paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I remember the gala. I remember seeing a woman in a green dress crying in the coat check room. I didn't do anything about it. None of us did." She met his eyes. "Maybe we all have things to make right." 2 weeks after that, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Malcolm walked into Bloomfield carrying a brown paper bag. Cora spotted him through the window and pressed her face against the glass, her breath fogging the pain. "Mama, the tall man is back, and he has a bag." Isla looked up from an arrangement she was building, a cascade of wild roses and ferns that looked like something pulled from a fairy tale. Her expression was cautious but no longer afraid. "What's in the bag?" she asked. "Grilled cheese sandwiches from that place on Germantown Ave. Cora mentioned last time that she likes the ones with tomato, and Jonah said he prefers his cut into triangles." Isla stared at him. "You remembered how Jonah likes his sandwiches cut." "I remember everything they tell me," Malcolm said. "I have 4 years to catch up on." Jonah appeared from the back room, drawn by the smell of grilled cheese. He looked at Malcolm, then at the bag, then back at Malcolm. "Did you bring the triangle ones?" he asked. "I did." Jonah nodded with satisfaction, then took Malcolm's hand and led him to the children's table in the corner, as if this were something they did every day. As if fathers showed up with sandwiches cut the right way, and it was the most normal thing in the world. They ate lunch together at the tiny table, Malcolm's knees practically touching his chin in the child-sized chair, while Cora described the latest developments in Professor Buttons' transformation, and Jonah showed him a drawing of the solar system, with all the planets labeled in careful handwriting. "Mama helped me spell Neptune," Jonah admitted. "It's tricky. Your mama's pretty smart," Malcolm said. "The smartest," Cora agreed. "She can fix anything. Last week the sink broke and she fixed it with a video on her phone and a wrench. She also cried a little bit when the water sprayed her face," Jonah added honestly. "But she still fixed it." Malcolm looked at Isla, who was laughing despite herself, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand the same way she used to, when something was too beautiful and too painful to hold at the same time. 6 months later, Malcolm Crane stood behind the counter of Bloomfield, wearing a green apron and learning how to strip thorns from rose stems without bleeding. He'd stepped down as CEO of Crane Biomedical 3 months earlier, handing operational control to his chief science officer, a brilliant woman who'd been ready for the job for years. The board had called him reckless. His mother still wasn't speaking to him. Business magazines ran stories about the biotech mogul who chose flowers over pharmaceuticals. He didn't care. "Daddy, you're doing it wrong again," Cora informed him, watching his thorn-stripping technique with professional concern. "You have to go down, not up. Mama showed you like 5 times. 6 times, Jonah corrected quietly from his corner, where he was reading a book about ocean ecosystems. "I counted 7, Isla called from the back room. "But who's counting?" Malcolm looked down at his scratched hands, then at his daughter's exasperated face, then at his son's quiet smile, and felt something he hadn't felt in the entire decade he'd spent building his empire. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. That evening, after the shop was closed and the children were in bed, Cora, clutching a stuffed caterpillar she'd named Professor Buttons, Junior and Jonah sleeping with his notebook under his pillow, Malcolm and Isla sat on the back steps of the shop, watching fireflies blink in the small garden where the children grew tomatoes and sunflowers. Cora told Mrs. Randall today that her daddy used to be a billionaire, but now he's a flower person, Isla said, trying not to laugh. Mrs. Randall looked very confused. "I'm a terrible flower person," Malcolm admitted. "I killed 3 succulents this week. They're supposed to be unkillable. You're getting better." "At succulents or at everything?" Isla leaned against his shoulder, and the simple weight of her felt more valuable than every asset he'd ever owned. "At everything." Isla, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. Not a diamond, a small moonstone set in a delicate gold band that caught the firefly light like something alive. "I bought this myself. No assistant, no jeweler consultation, no 6-figure price tag. I saw it in a shop window on Germantown Ave and it reminded me of you." Isla looked at the ring, then at him. "Malcolm Crane, are you proposing to me on the back steps of my flower shop in your work apron?" "I'm proposing to you in the first place that ever felt like home," he said. "In a dirty apron because that's what real life looks like." "Yes," she whispered, then louder, laughing through tears. "Yes." From inside the apartment above the shop, a small voice rang out. "Did he finally ask her?" Cora shouted. "Jonah, wake up!" Daddy asked Mama. "I'm already awake," Jonah called back calmly. "I heard the whole thing." He did good. Malcolm and Isla looked at each other and laughed, the kind of laughter that comes from discovering that your life has become something more beautiful than you ever planned, messier, and smaller, and infinitely more real than anything money could design. "Come see the ring." Isla called up to the children, and within seconds both of them appeared at the back door in their pajamas, Cora bouncing with excitement, and Jonah carrying his notebook where he'd apparently been keeping a list, titled Wedding Plans, in his careful handwriting. "I want to carry the flowers," Cora announced. "And Jonah wants to read his poem about butterflies. It's about metamorphosis," Jonah clarified, "and it's scientifically accurate." "It's perfect," Malcolm said, pulling both children into his arms, while Isla leaned against all 3 of them, this family that had grown itself from broken soil and bloomed anyway. Above them, the city hummed with its million lives and stories. But in this small garden, behind a flower shop, in Chestnut Hill, a man who'd once measured his worth in stock prices learned that the only numbers that mattered were the ones sleeping in the next room, the years he'd get to make up for, and the single, steady heartbeat of the woman who'd taught him that love wasn't something you scheduled between meetings. It was the thing you built your whole life around. And sometimes, if you were patient enough and brave enough and willing to let yourself become soup for a while, you came out the other side with wings. Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. What moments from Malcolm and Isla's journey resonated most with you? Do you believe that love can truly conquer all obstacles when 2 people are willing to fight for it? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.